Full spoilers ahead for Eternals. Eternals is a great film. It's an exploration of the human condition and our relationship with the divine, as well as our own power of will and ability of choice. The film asks the question, what does it mean to be human? And ultimately, not unlike a certain big red celestial, it presents us with a dilemma. Is humanity worth saving? To do this, the film dives into existential philosophy, as well as exploring the act of storytelling itself, how myths are made, and the way this process bridges the gap between the human and the superhuman. And if you give me a chance, I'll explain why and how all of this is accomplished. But let's get into Eternals, Marvel's existential masterpiece. To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. This is the opening quatrain from William Blake's poem Auguries of Innocence. It's also what Chloe Zhao, director of Eternals, used to open her pitch for the film to Kevin Feige, head of Marvel Studios. This was, according to Feige, the best pitch he had ever heard. This is what Zhao had to say about the reason for using this passage in her pitch.
Because what Blake was trying to say is that you can see the endless cosmic beauty in the smallest things on the planet. Jack Kirby's great creation of the Eternals deserve that level of scale and intimacy.
This is an idea that comes through strongly in the film, I think, and it is one we will return to. But I think there's a deeper reason why Zhao used the poetry of Blake in the process of creating this film, one that's crucial to the film's philosophy and the very nature of the Eternals, even going back to their creation in the 70s. And it's to do with myth-making. You see, Blake's poetry was heavily Christian. We can see this a few lines further into Auguries of Innocence, as the poem starts mentioning things like heaven, hell, and cherubim. But that's only the tip of a large and weird iceberg, because the sort of Christian theology Blake injected into much of his poetics was far from normal. He was inspired by John Milton's Paradise Lost, itself a fairly radical text, as well as paganism, druidism, and some more esoteric stuff like supposed visions and like apocryphal theories and predictions and stuff. And the form these influences took in much of Blake's writing is a sort of mythology, where archetypal figures with names like Albion, Tharmas, Urizen, Orc, and many more represent various religious, psychological, or symbolic qualities. Some of these beings are even called Eternals by Blake, which is fun. But this isn't a video on Blake specifically, so I'm going to gloss this and get to the point. Blake's poetry is about more than mythology. Blake isn't just doing what some of his contemporaries would do, like John Keats in his Hyperion poems, where they'd use existing mythologies like ancient Greco-Roman gods in interesting ways. No, Blake created a mythology to use. This is a process we call Mythopoeia. And in broad terms, it's the same sort of thing we see with people like J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, creating myths and worlds and characters with which to tell stories. But Blake's Mythopoeia wasn't just about fantasy, it was a philosophical way of integrating into his poetics and seriously exploring concepts like emotion, psychology, and maybe above all, the human experience and its relationship to divinity, godhood. In a sense, what Blake did was take existing mythological and theological templates and from them form a new world in order to ponder existential questions. And there's a parallel here to the Eternals, because that's sort of what Jack Kirby was going for when he created these characters. You see, Kirby created the Eternals after his previous book at DC, New Gods, got cancelled, and they're quite similar thematically speaking. Both focus on families of godly beings inserted into the same comic book format mostly reserved for superheroes, that is, costumed, mostly human crime fighters. The question being asked here, implicitly as well as sometimes explicitly, was, in a medium where people can do fantastical things, what exactly separates them from gods? Kirby was always fascinated by mythology. Even his early works back in the 40s display this, with an early strip showing the Roman god Jupiter sending his son Mercury to stop the current conflict on Earth, i.e. World War II. These themes would echo throughout his work for decades afterwards. By the time we get to the 70s, we see Kirby creating at DC his Fourth World saga, of which New Gods was a part, in an act of Mythopoeia, again similar to that of figures like Tolkien. But like Blake before him, Kirby's Mythopoeia was infused with a philosophical edge. Anthony Keane of the Open University writes that there was a, quote, greater moral complexity in this later period of Kirby's, in which we see the New Gods and the Eternals, than his earlier work creating heroes like Thor and the Fantastic Four. The Eternals, particularly, are, quote, ambiguous. They are on the side of humanity, but their motives are their own, and Kirby presents them as if to suggest that they can't fully be trusted. Sersi, in particular, treats humanity as a source of amusement. This is as good a place as any to point out that Zhao's film differs immensely from the early Kirby work on Eternals, and the differing characterizations of Sersi show this. But let's circle back to the film, because while changes are made in terms of plot, character, and philosophy, the main thing the movie takes from Kirby's original Eternals is this focus on mythopoeia, on myth-making, and an exploration through these ideas of godhood, the human experience, and what, if anything, links the two. The most obvious way this theme is visible in the film, and indeed the source material, is the Eternals' names. It's touched on a few times, most explicitly at the end of the film, where Athena talks to Phastos' kid, but each of the Eternals, save for Druig, corresponds to a mythological figure or trope. So, for instance, Sersi, the Eternal with the power of transmutation, corresponds to Sersi, the witch from the Odyssey, who transforms Odysseus' crewmates into pigs. Macquarie, the speedster, is Mercury, messenger of the gods in the Roman pantheon. Phastos the tech wizard is the Greek god and master craftsman Hephaestus, and Gilgamesh's strength and loyal friendship to Athena are pretty straightforwardly reflective of the legendary character of the same name. It's the same for most of the Eternals, but the film really capitalizes on this aspect of the characters. We see a few times moments of explicit myth-making and reception of legends. At one point in ancient Babylon, we see Sprite using her illusions to rehearse a version of the Gilgamesh myth, and it is the Gilgamesh myth. She references Enkidu, who in the Epic of Gilgamesh was the hero's best friend and companion, a character otherwise entirely absent from the world of Eternals. This snippet of storytelling then captures a point where Gilgamesh's reception is somewhere in between the Eternal we see and get to know in the film and the God King of ancient Sumerian legend. Similarly, in the present day we're introduced to Kingo as he stars in a Bollywood retelling of the legend of Ikaris, a story in which that character seems to have attained a similar quasi-divinity. And as we will find out in the film, the Eternals aren't really gods at all. The film then explicitly signposts an interest in the dynamics of mythopoeia, and how ideas of godhood are formed and shaped, and most importantly of all, how they fail. It's at this point we have to consider the context of the Eternals. Just as with Kirby's original versions of these characters, the Eternals exist in the same cultural space as superheroes, and the Eternals film explicitly addresses this fact and implicates these characters in the wider Marvel world, in a way that Kirby's original comics were sometimes reluctant to do. Ikaris is compared to Superman, and in Australia the Eternals briefly discuss the Avengers, with Sprite sort of equating Captain America and Iron Man with themselves, and Ikaris seems to accept this equation, suggesting that he could be the team's new leader. Eternals and superheroes are of a likeness then. This is indicated by the film and by the Eternals themselves, even before they learn the truth of their origins. But when they do, this point becomes much clearer. They're not immortal beings from Olympia with a divinely sanctioned, objectively moral mission. They're just pawns, created in some sense by a race of powerful beings with their own pretty morally dicey goals and agendas. Sure, the Celestials are ancient and vastly powerful, but, and I'll go into more depth on this later, the trappings of divinity they have at first in the eyes of characters like Sersi don't survive the film. And the Eternals' mission to destroy the Deviants, well, the transcendent rightness of this mission also comes crashing down when it becomes clear that the Deviants are almost identical to the Eternals, created to be pawns by the Celestials with their own consciousness and sense of family. They've just started evolving from their given role before the Eternals did. We'll come back to this collapse of purpose, but for now, let's look at the implications of the truth of the Deviants. There's a point in the film where Sersi realizes that they share these qualities and origins with the Deviants. She says it makes the Deviants more dangerous. No, says Druig. It makes them us, he says. I'm also going to talk more about the Deviants below, but for now the point is that by the halfway mark in the movie, the Eternals are forced to confront the fact that they are not moral crusaders, born into an ordered world with a god-given and divinely sanctioned place and purpose within it. Their existence is just as chaotic and messy as ours, and similarly lacks any transcendent meaning. And if humans are indistinguishable from Eternals in this way, then the reverse is true too. The point isn't just that freak cases like Spider-Man and Captain America are effacing the physical gaps between Eternals and humanity. It's not that humans are just now evolving to reach the level of the Eternals. It's that from an ontological point of view, it's becoming clearer and clearer that there's no essential difference between them, and there never was. And we're shown explicitly that this erosion has become more and more visible for the Eternals in the past few years of their lives. They now live in a world where a normal man like Tony Stark, not irradiated, not mutated, can harness the powers of creation itself to change the entire universe. This case is cited by Ajak, the one being who'd known the truth of their existence the whole while, as being the reason that she finally rejected the grand narrative of Arishem. For the Prime Eternal then, the human events we've seen ourselves in the MCU's Infinity Saga constitute a sort of reverse singularity, the point at which her species is fundamentally stripped of its special and transcendent place in the universe. It's this point at which it behooves us to start thinking about another of the film's major themes, that is purpose. Fate and determinism, because the main thing which fed into the Eternals' illusion of superiority for 7,000 years is this idea that they had a defined role in life, a meaning to their existence commanded by what seemed to be a divine authority. We see this from early in the film when Sprite and Sersi are explaining to Dane the role of the Eternals. They talk about goals they were, quote, meant to accomplish, and they're waiting until they are told to go home. In essence then, the Eternals imagine themselves as little more than puppets of the will of Arishem. The Eternals' faith in this purpose is what drove them to do so many morally questionable things, like staying on the sidelines in wars and genocides, and it's Ikaris' refusal to abandon this faith which drives and justifies his actions in this film, killing and maiming his own family. This issue, the question of how individuals and their actions are changed by the perception of an essential purpose to life, or the lack thereof, is in many ways the central conflict to the film. Faced with the prospect of a world in which their values, the principles which have driven them for 7 millennia, cease to be objectively right, the Eternals react in different ways. Some, like Ajak and Sersi, become driven by a sort of humanism. Having rejected the worldview of the Celestials, they find meaning in people, both through interpersonal ties, like their love for the other Eternals, or in Sersi's case humans, or through the belief, which I think we see in Sersi, that existence is worthwhile, that people are capable of great good, and not just evil. Some, like Druig and Phastos, began to lose faith in the worldview of the Celestials, and the sense of transcendent purpose shared by the other Eternals well before they learnt of the Emergence, or Tiamat. For Druig, the moment he rejects this is half a millennium ago. In the Tenochtitlan sequence, he leaves the Eternals and rejects their cause. In Phastos' case, his faith fails after World War II, when he perceives that their mission, and his actions specifically, have contributed to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If their mission was to help humanity grow as he thought it was, then this is evidence that they haven't made any progress. They've just allowed technology and the population to advance, and humanity is just as childish, violent, and capricious as it ever was. Which, unbeknownst to him, was the real mission all along. In both cases, Druig and Phastos don't seem to completely reject the authority of the Celestials and the truth of their mission, they just don't think it's worth it. They don't feel they can personally continue down this path anymore. These cases, even if they don't find Eternals openly rejecting and overhauling the moral framework and telos of the Eternals' celestial-given mission, they do give us our first glance at characters questioning these principles and attempting to live outside them. And one of the major reasons I think these two join Sersi's side in the film's second half, as opposed to Kingo, Sprite, or Ikaris, is that when the grand narrative of the Eternals' divine purpose is revealed to be a fabrication, Phastos and Druig then realize that there was nothing stopping them from actually intervening and saving human life all these years, nothing except their own ignorance of reality and blind faith in false gods. As a result, now that they know their actions are their own and always have been, they feel the crushing responsibility to use these actions for the right cause. They don't have the luxury of certitude anymore. They can't automatically know what this right cause is, but in this case they feel a need to atone for the actions they took previously while under the sway of the Celestials' false purpose. If this all feels very existential, that's because it is. And I'm not just saying that to add some false philosophical depth to a Marvel movie. I'm saying it because this dynamic is directly reminiscent of some of the points Jean-Paul Sartre makes in his essay Existentialism is a Humanism, an essay widely considered to be a foundational text in the 20th century existential tradition. But first, some of you may well be wondering, what is existentialism? Well, most simply, it's the branch of philosophy which deals in human existence. But more specifically, according to Sartre, most modern truly existential thinkers share a core belief, that existence precedes essence. But what does this mean? Sartre gives the example of a paper knife, what we might nowadays call a letter opener. When an artisan sets out to create a paper knife, the essence of the paper knife is present before its physical existence begins. That is, the artisan already has a pre-developed process of manufacture for the knife. He knows precisely what he needs to do to make it. In addition, the idea of the paper knife and the need for a device to cut paper, these things are already fully formed before the knife is physically constructed. In this case, the knife's essence comes before its existence. The key to the existentialist's position is that for humanity, the opposite is true, that we exist first and that the essence of ourselves follows, is built, in fact, by our actions. This is unlike much previous religious or philosophical thinking, which held that human essence preceded human existence. Previous philosophers often believed in a transcendent human nature, present to some degree in all people, anywhere, ever. Thus, this essence preceded human existence. To a Christian, much like an artisan creating a paper knife, God's plan for humanity, God's plan for each human, in fact, preceded the first creation. Human essence was decided well in advance, and humanity is bound by the limits of this plan, this blueprint. This was a common position to which Sartre and other existentialists were opposed, and we see a sort of parallel philosophical development occurring in Eternals. To begin with, we believe alongside our characters that they were sent by the just and godlike Celestials to act as their agents throughout the universe, guarding intelligent life from the evil Deviants. While it's a little unclear what they thought actually created them, since it appears to be a shock to Sersi when she discovers their literal fabrication at the hands of the Celestials, it's clear that the Eternals are, to begin with, utterly devoted to their mission, and that they believe their God-given purpose, the essence for their existence, to be this role assigned to them by Arisham, that is, deviant hunters. At this point, we and the Eternals both think that for an Eternal, essence precedes existence. Much like a paper knife, this purpose, this need for them, seemed to predate their existence. But over the film, this illusion breaks down. We learn that the Deviants were also created for a single specific purpose by the Celestials, but that they evolved beyond it. That tells us one main thing, that while the Celestials intended to create a race of beings for one specific purpose, expressions of a pre-existing essence, they failed. The beings they created were able to move beyond their allotted role, and as such, for the Deviants, existence precedes essence, because the ideal Deviants, which the Celestials had planned, were never realized. The Celestials failed to create beings which matched this image, and instead accidentally created beings with unintended potential to go beyond what had been planned. And while Arishem reveals that the Eternals were physically made by the Celestials, they are not perfect realizations of a pre-existing pattern either. That was the idea, but just like with the Deviants, we see the Eternals going beyond the limits they were supposed to have, both through their choices to rebel and through Sersi's evolving and growing powers, with which halfway through the film she can, for the first time, transmute living material. Eternals and Deviants, neither of these resemble what they were created to be. Despite their intelligent design, we can understand them as Sartre understood humanity, as examples of existence preceding essence. The result of this is, per Sartre, massive. He writes, "If it is true that existence is prior to essence, man is responsible for what he is. Thus, the first effect of existentialism is that it puts every man in possession of himself as he is, and places the entire responsibility for his existence squarely upon his own shoulders." Going back to the film, this is precisely what we saw earlier, with the various Eternals rejecting the purpose assigned to them by the Celestials, when they realize they exist not as expressions of some divine pattern, but as things unto themselves, holding the power to define their own essence, as Sartre suggests above, they grasp two things. The first is free will. The second is the responsibility for that free will. We've talked about this already before we got onto Sartre. It's what Druig and Phastos feel when they realise that they always had the ability to go against the plan. This crushing responsibility drives them to make what they perceive to be the right choice and help Sersi save the Earth. It's also worth mentioning the way the Eternals' individual judgments on human worth directly correspond to the survival of the race, because this also echoes a concept of Sartre's, existential anguish. Sartre writes, quote, "When a man commits himself to anything, fully realizing that he is not only choosing what he will be, but is thereby at the same time a legislator deciding for the whole of mankind, in such a moment, a man cannot escape from the sense of complete and profound responsibility." For Sartre, if human existence precedes any sort of predefined essence, and if in making decisions and undertaking actions man defines his own essence, then each individual decision any human makes at any point represents their vision for humanity as a whole. Like if you're walking down the street and you see a bin knocked over, if you pick it back up, then you're implicitly making the declaration that everyone else, all of humanity, should have made the same decision had they been in your place. So that's what we see in Eternals. When these individuals have to decide for themselves whether humanity is fundamentally worth saving, they are literally deciding this for the whole world at once. The Eternals, then, is a story of a race of beings discovering that the gods they worship don't hold ultimate power, didn't create them according to a perfect pattern, and as a result they themselves possess the ultimate power to determine not only their essence, what they are, but also what becomes of them, and if humanity as a whole deserves to exist. And in making this choice on an individual basis, they become, in Sartre's words, a legislator deciding for the whole of mankind. This is what drives the film's plot from the moment the Eternals' origins are revealed. But we've talked about this solely from the perspective of humanity's defenders so far. What about Ikaris? What does he represent in all of this? And what can Sartre's existentialism tell us about his choices and his fate? The major difference between Ikaris and the others is that he knew about the emergence and the truth of the Eternals' mission on Earth, but this didn't lead to a questioning or rejection of the veracity of their purpose. For Ikaris, this revelation that their purpose was to sacrifice humanity to birth the Celestial wasn't self-evidently wrong, as it was to Sersi, and unlike Druig or Phastos, Ikaris hadn't struggled previously with the reality of human suffering, or been tempted to intervene. I think this is because Ikaris had never bonded with humanity in the same way that many of the others had. We see in the Babylon sequence that one of the only times he actually engaged with, helped individual humans, was when he was trying to get closer to Sersi. Ikaris was always just concerned with the mission, with being what the Celestials wanted him to be. Except when it came to Sersi, but we'll get back to that. When it comes to the film's climax, when it comes to the Eternals choosing sides in their conflict, I think the most important thing to understand is that for Ikaris, it's not that he's choosing humanity's death. From his point of view, he isn't making that existential choice which we see being made by figures like Sersi or Phastos or Druig. His defense of Tiamat is instead because, from his perspective, he doesn't have the ability to choose. The choice was made by the Celestials thousands of years ago, and Ikaris still understands his purpose, his essence, to be a predetermined exact reflection of the will of Arishem. Ikaris doesn't think that he's judging humanity, becoming, as Sartre would say, a legislator deciding for the whole of mankind, because in his mind, he isn't Sartre's existential man, for whom existence precedes essence. Instead, he's closer to Sartre's paper knife, an exact and faithful creation of divine artisans whose plans define him and the paths he must follow. And that's what he does, until he doesn't. Because Ikaris has the chance to stop Sersi from transforming Tiamat, but he doesn't. He joins the Unimind and helps her. So let's get into this moment, this pivot, because I can't overstate how important it is. The moment where Ikaris joins the Unimind is preceded by a flashback montage of his time with Sersi in the human world. We're seeing Ikaris confronted by the love and happiness he's shared with Sersi over thousands of years, and the realization that this joy and these experiences are more important to him than the given purpose which he'd followed zealously until this point. This is the point then at which Ikaris is forced to confront the necessity of choice. When Ikaris' conviction to serving the will of the Celestials is beaten by the importance to him of something outside that narrow given purpose, that is, his love for Sersi, to return to Sartre, we might say that he realizes that this essence, what he has become over 7,000 years, is greater than the blueprint from which the Celestials attempted to create him. And so part of him now accepts that existence preceded the essence of this current Ikaris. And now he is conscious for the first time of his ability to choose, and the responsibilities which that ability of choice brings. To choose the fate of his fellow Eternals, as well as the fate of humanity as a whole. And he chooses to switch sides and support Sersi's Unimind. We will come back to the moment of his actual choice, what it entails and why he makes it in a little while. But for now, let's talk about the aftermath. When the deed is done, Ikaris flies straight into the sun, seemingly committing suicide. This isn't him overwhelmed by guilt over killing Tiamat. I don't even think it's guilt for betraying Arishem. Instead, it's similar to what we saw earlier with Druig and Phastos. When Ikaris realizes that the purpose he'd committed his life to following wasn't objectively right, and that he always had a choice to oppose it, he feels the same crushing responsibility for his actions that drove Phastos to walk away post-World War II and Druig to leave earlier. Only this time it's much worse. Ikaris now feels, for the first time, the responsibility for the deaths of Ajak and Gilgamesh. Before this point, it wasn't his fault. That's what he tells himself, at least. It was their fault for deviating from the path laid out for them, and Ikaris had no choice but to protect the will of Arishem, and if that meant killing his family, then so be it. But now that Ikaris is awakened to his power of choice, he also feels the crushing weight of responsibility which Sartre attached to his notion of existential anguish. It all falls upon him at once, and it's simply too much for him to bear. So into the sun he goes. The film's climax then is all about embracing human subjectivity and accepting what Sartre calls the ability of man to propel itself towards a future. When people talk about the way philosophy moved towards ideas like Sartre's and away from the religious belief in an all-knowing, benevolent God as the basis of morality and indeed the human experience, a common way this shift is conceptualized is as the death of God. And I don't think it's a coincidence that all the action in Eternal's last act revolves around the literal killing of a godly being, resulting in the awakening of characters such as Ikaris to their own being, their own authentic existence and existential freedom. If this film is about the human experience then, we should conceive of the finale as staging a conflict not between superheroes and supervillains, not good guys versus bad guys, but as a conflict between individual agency, human subjectivity, and the forces which would oppose this: fate, institutions, systems, or even faith and obedience to higher powers. And what we see on screen as Sersi and Ikaris face off ultimately represents a triumph of subjectivity, albeit an ambiguous one, because while Ikaris does finally embrace his ability to propel himself towards a future of his own choosing, he's forced to take on the consequences and responsibilities that come with it, and they destroy him. This is the central conflict of the finale, and indeed the entire film. The Deviants, even the talking Deviant, they were never the antagonists of this story. They were never supposed to be. Fate and determinism, these are the forces the Eternals are fighting. I think this might be one of the reasons for the film's lukewarm reception. Disappointment in the villains, in the Deviants. I've heard it said quite widely that this final fight we see at the end between Thena and the head Deviant didn't feel like a confrontation between the major antagonist and the heroes. Well, it was never meant to. The Deviants' main contribution to this film is to kickstart the plot and afterwards to hold up a mirror to the Eternals, thematically speaking, to illustrate that just because they're products of the Celestials doesn't mean they don't have the power to change and become more than that. In the third act fight between the head Deviant and Thena, the conflict here reflects that, because neither participant is driven by the purpose given to them by the Celestials, not anymore. The Deviant tries to kill Thena to avenge its species, and Thena is holding off the Deviant so her team can stop the Celestials' planned emergence. Moreover, Thena's coup de grace, the final move that wins her the fight, is motivated by her link to Gilgamesh, triggered as it is by the Deviant's invocation of the way he'd tell her to remember and snap out of her mad weary. This fight then, the ultimate end of the Eternal Deviant rivalry, is based entirely upon emotions. You might call it a very human affair. The takeaway from this conflict, like the one happening above on the volcano, is that the races created by the Celestials have become authentic beings, capable of existing in their own right, and for their own ends. This is a film more interested in raising and debating philosophical questions through its characters and antagonists than it is in setting up the standard plot progressions we typically see in Marvel films, and for some reason this is being held against it. But characters and aspects of a film aren't only important if they have a crucial narrative payoff in the film's climax. For me, the whole point of giving Eternals to a filmmaker like Zhao was to make a film that doesn't do things in the same way, avoids the beaten path, and yet giving the Deviants a role within the film that's more relevant thematically than narratively seems to be grinding a lot of gears, and I think that's a shame. I've not been basing this essay on people's complaints with the film though, for a few reasons. One, I've sort of talked about some of those before, and two, I wanted this to be a video that puts out a positive interpretation of Eternals, rather than one that defends it from negative ones. Because there's a difference between making the case for a film as good, as deep and complex, versus the case for it not being bad. But I do want to pick up one more critical comment on the film to introduce my final point. One idea brought up commonly, for example in the Seattle Refines review of the film, is that Eternals sets out to make a case for the survival of humanity but fails. This particular review phrases it thusly: "The case for saving the humans is weak, and what's more, we spend over 2 hours living with the Eternals, hardly a human in sight. They don't really mean much in this story." While I think it's true that Eternals does set out an argument for humanity, I think it's more accurate to say that the film openly sets up the question, is humanity worth saving, and offers arguments both for and against. The major arguments aren't actually anything about the emergence, and future Eternals creating stars or whatever. That's all incidental, really, to the question of the worth of humanity. The real arguments against are the dark events which drive the Eternals themselves to despair, the genocides, the mass slaughter, the atomic bombs. But what about the arguments in favour of humanity? This review is right in saying that literal humans aren't the focus of the film, and indeed we don't see them too much. The only humans with halfway notable roles in the film are Dane and Karun, neither of which really have a huge impact on the narrative. But I think the film does make this argument, albeit implicitly, through the Eternals. Because if there's been one central theme throughout this essay, through the discussion of Mythopoeia, through the discussion of the wider MCU and the increasingly thin line between human and superhuman being, and through the application of Sartre's existential philosophy to the film, it's been that whichever way we choose to look at the film, whichever themes we bring to the forefront, it's hard to escape the idea that the Eternals are functionally human. Sure, not biologically, but in pretty much any other way that means a damn. Sersi, Athena, Ikaris and co, they're almost indistinguishable from the humans which had been the focus of the MCU up until this point. They have our faces, our emotions, and we've seen them go through the same crisis of existence, which Sartre held to be essentially human. There's a moment in the film, in the Tenochtitlan sequence, when the Eternals believe they've finally gotten rid of the Deviants. Ajak tells the rest of them to go and live a life among the humans, to experience their lives which are full of love and enjoyment and creating beautiful things. Look, that's not an exact quote, but it's been like 2 weeks since I've seen the film, so it's the best you're gonna get. The thing is, by the present day portion of the film, we see all of these human qualities in the Eternals themselves. Sersi and Phastos have fallen for mortals, for instance, and we see Athena making art. It's hard to see these moments as anything other than demonstrations that after 7 long millennia, the Eternals have functionally become members of the society they've been with for so long. And returning to the moment in the film's climax where Ikaris makes his choice, chooses to save Earth and humanity, I think we see Ikaris realise this for himself. When he's in that moment, making the decision whether to save the world or let it die, he sees this montage of his time with Sersi, their life, their love, their joy. We've talked earlier about how Ikaris realises here the importance of these memories and experiences to him. In terms of the film's case for humanity though, this moment is doubly important, because if the Eternals have functionally become human, then the reason Ikaris chooses to defend humanity from the emergence seems to be a realization on his part that within Sersi and his meaningful time with her, he can see for the first time a facsimile of human existence and its potential for beauty. What were those lines of Blake again? To see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. Zhao said that for her, this was Blake illustrating how the splendour of existence at large is visible in even the smallest things. And this synecdochal vision, the ability to apprehend larger concepts through a microcosm of them, is precisely how Ikaris finally sees the case for humanity, and how the film makes its own points on human existence. It's through the Eternals themselves. These are the film's avatars of humanity, and through them we see our own qualities reflected. In Gilgamesh we see friendship, loyalty, self-sacrifice. In Athena we see the strength of humanity to bear burdens and fight against illness. Druig and Phastos show our capacity for innovation and our empathy, our will and drive to alleviate suffering and injustice. And like Ikaris, we see in Sersi our own awesome capacity for love. It's not all positive. In Ikaris we see the violence we're capable of in blind devotion to a cause, and in Sprite's heel turn we see the way attachment and selfish motivations can lead to dark things. Matching Sartre, none of this is some idea of an essential human nature. That doesn't exist. And the Eternals aren't imbued with it. What we see instead, what undergirds this implicit case for humanity the film makes, is our essential freedom and capacity to shape our world and ourselves. And like the Eternals, it's up to each one of us to decide if this argument for humanity is strong enough to convince us that we're worth fighting for. So the film does make a case for humanity, and maybe you agree with the Seattle Refined review that it's a weak case. Maybe it is a weak case. That's for everyone to decide themselves. And I think our answer to this question says more about us individually than it does about the film. But the best films don't suggest a question and then beat you over the head with an unequivocal answer. And Eternals isn't any different. Does the good we see in the Eternals outweigh the bad we see in them, or the bad we see in people? We can disagree. Or we can think, in the words of Karun, that we must learn from our mistakes and do better. Metaphorically then, the role of Arishem at the film's end becomes the role of the viewer. We too must evaluate the lives of the Eternals, and within them, we must determine for ourselves the worth of humanity and of human existence. Returning once more to Sartre's comments on existential anguish, the reappearance of Arishem in his capacity as celestial judge at the film's end explicitly places him and us into the same position Sartre suggests all humanity occupies whenever they make a choice, a legislator deciding the fate of all humanity. So, what's it gonna be? That's why I think Eternals is good. Great, in fact. It's a thematically rich, genuinely thought-provoking piece which brings a sense of existentialism reminiscent of Sartre to the big screen, doing so in a way that embraces and elevates the medium, that is, superhero films. This isn't a review, I'm not really talking about visuals or performances. Maybe I would have touched upon aspects such as those if I'd been able to, access the film at home while writing this, but I hope I've shown you that whatever your problems with this film, whatever you may not like, there's a rock-solid philosophical spine to this movie, and it deserves recognition for that. I don't really do long-form analysis like this, mainly because it takes far too long for the upload schedule I've been trying to keep at present. I've been thinking about this for weeks and actively writing it for about 4 days. Recording it took about 2.5 hours, and editing it is going to be literal hell. My Eternals videos haven't really done well statistically, so from a channel growth standpoint, this really wasn't worth it at all. But I really wanted to do something like this because I feel the film deserves it. And if you like this format, if you actually manage to watch till the end, let me know, and maybe I'll waste a whole bunch of time on more stuff like this in the future. I'd really love to hear what you thought of my reading and my arguments too, so chuck it in the comments if you feel like it. And there's links to the Sartre, Blake, and Seattle Refined pieces I've mentioned in the description below. So yeah, thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you soon.